Scott Greenberger from the Pew Charitable Trust. I'm executive editor of State Line, which is Pew's daily news service. We cover state politics and policy from a national perspective, and I'm happy to be here today and to be joined by our two panelists, Representative Casey Becker from House District 13. Representative Becker represents a district which includes parts of Boulder County and all of Clear Creek, Gilpin, Grand, and Jackson counties. During her time in the House, she's worked on numerous issues, including energy conservation, environmental protection, rural economic development, and increased accountability for the many tax credits offered by the state, which accounts for her presence on the stage with us today. Prior to joining the House, she served on the Boulder City Council, also worked in real estate development and for the U.S. Department of the Interior. Robert Zradnik is a fellow Pewster. He is policy director for Pew's work on state fiscal health and economic growth. He oversees research on tax incentive evaluation. Before joining Pew, Bob worked for the chief financial officer of the District of Columbia, managing a research agenda covering tax, budget, and economic policies and practices. So I thought we'd just dive in here. This is a panel on tax expenditures. So I think the first question is, what are tax expenditures and why do they matter so much? Representative Becker.
Do you want me to answer that, or is this thing on? Did that go on?
Okay.
Yeah,
I think so.
I can start if you'd like.
Sure.
So Pew started working on tax expenditures and tax expenditure evaluation about 4 years ago, in part because we recognized that tax expenditures are essentially credits, deductions, exemptions that lower the amount of revenue going into the state, but they are not reviewed during the annual budget process. So it's oftentimes these provisions are put on the books and then they're really never looked at again. And so because of that, we decided to sort of embark on some research to find out how much do states really know about tax expenditures, and in our case specifically tax incentives for economic development. And our initial research found that most states don't regularly review them, they don't do evaluations, so they don't really have a sense of whether they're delivering a strong return on investment. And I think that was the case in Colorado when Casey started looking into this.
Sure. So in Colorado, I serve on the Finance Committee, and recently we, especially in 2014 and 15, started seeing a huge number of bills being brought that were tax credits, tax refunds, tax deductions. And that's, I think, largely driven, I think most folks here are from Colorado, driven by the fact that we have TABOR, the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. And TABOR sets a ceiling where state revenue is not allowed to go above that ceiling. And if you do a tax credit in Colorado, it lowers the revenue coming into the state and therefore keeps us below the TABOR limit. And so legislators started figuring this out and realizing, I don't have money, there's no money in the state budget for me to do a grant for a particular thing that I like, but I can do a tax credit. And then the revenue never comes into the state, we stay below the TABOR limit, and I've suddenly got a grant mechanism. And so I think in 2015, actually, we saw over 40 different bills for tax credits and tax deductions. And at the same time that was happening, previously a bill had been passed where we were starting to see the first tax profile and expenditure reports. So the state has started putting together, pursuant to another bill, a list of all of our tax expenditures. And I think legislators started noticing for the first time that there were a couple hundred of these, and that the total fiscal impact was about $5 billion in different tax credits, tax deductions. And also started noticing that they get in the tax code and they just go on forever. And there were some that dated back to the 1930s. And I think that our priorities of a state may have shifted a little since the 1930s. Maybe these are still good ideas, but we were never evaluating them. So more and more were being proposed. TABOR was becoming a big impact to our state budget. And we actually had a list to see what the impact was and see what some of them were. So being on the Finance Committee, I said, we've got to do something about this.
So what did you do about it? What the legislation that was passed, talk to us a little bit about what's in that legislation and how this will work in Colorado.
Sure. Well, like a lot of good legislation, it doesn't often pass the first year. But I started looking into this issue, and we realized that Pew was also working on this issue, sat down with them and worked on some legislation, and sat down with stakeholders. And our tax expenditures largely fall into a few categories: business incentive tax expenditures, a lot of farm and ag related ones, and then a lot of human services and social services. So we brought those groups together. I said, I'm going to start working on this. You know, what do you guys think? What do you have? What are your concerns? And I'd say that largely those organizations that were representing human services groups said, we're fine, take a look at them. We're comfortable that we can justify the affordable housing tax credit, the child care tax credit. The business groups were definitely concerned because tax incentives to lure businesses to grow jobs are an important tool that our economic development officers use. And they were just worried, how is this review going to happen? Who's going to do it? Are they going to be impartial? What are the criteria they're going to use? And what are you guys going to do with this data? So those were the initial challenges I think that we faced. And you know, that's with that feedback is really how we ended up crafting the bill. We found a neutral party, which is the state auditor. She's not an arm of the legislature. She's not a cabinet member appointed by the governor that is subject to his review. She can look at them truly from a nonpartisan manner. And then we really sort of talked about and worked on how we can inform the legislature about the economic impact of some of our tax breaks, and give stakeholders an opportunity to see that information and weigh in as well. And then how is it provided to the legislature? And initially, I had wanted to have a committee that would actually review these, to have a very active review of them. And that didn't go over well with some of the stakeholders. So the bill did that in 2015. It didn't pass. And that's one of the changes made in the 2016 legislation that said, we'll do a report and it'll get provided to the General Assembly, but we're not going to hold hearings specifically on them.
Bob, is that similar to how this process works in other states? I know Pew's been involved in working with other states on this, and some of them are further along in the process.
Yeah, so this has actually been a trend over the last 4 or 5 years. Since 2012, about 20 states have either created new tax expenditure evaluation laws or improved existing laws. Just this past session, in addition to Colorado, Alabama, Hawaii, Utah, and Virginia passed legislation. So it's quite a diverse mix of states: red states, blue states, just a wide range geographically, and not every state does it exactly the same. You know, there are different models in terms of who does the evaluation, in terms of the scope of the evaluation. Colorado chose to do all tax expenditures. Some states choose to do focus on a particular sector of tax expenditures. And then in terms of sort of the last point, you know, what happens to the evaluation once it's complete? In some cases, like for example, in Nebraska, the legislative auditor is doing the evaluation, and so the audit committee is sort of overseeing that process, but also the evaluation will go to the revenue committee, you know, because that's really who has jurisdiction over these tax incentives. I think in the case, you know, I think regardless of how that structure is established, you know, our sense is, you know, if a state produces a quality evaluation with clear findings, it's going to resonate in such a way that even if it wasn't required to have a hearing, I think there'll be legislators that are going to want to have a discussion about sort of the findings of that evaluation and really sort of elevate the conversation. So I think there's still an opportunity, even though it wasn't required in the legislation, to really have this evaluation influence policy and improve policy. That's really the goal. Let's understand, are these programs working as intended? You know, are some of them out of date? Are there ways to improve them? And then, you know, use that information to guide policymaking.
So it sounds like what you're saying is that once the states have different models, once these evaluations are done, it's pretty likely that people will pay attention to them, whether there's a formal mechanism for hearings or not.
Yeah, I believe that really rests on the quality of the evaluation, and I think the fact that the auditor in Colorado is doing the evaluation was a great choice. It's a nonpartisan professional organization, that's well respected on both sides of the aisle, and I think they're going to really dig into these programs. It's something that they're used to doing, and what we found in other states is if an evaluation is good and it's clear, it can really yield tangible results. I'll give a couple examples. Minnesota did an evaluation of their angel investor tax credit. This was a tax credit designed to benefit individuals and institutions that invest in small businesses, entrepreneurship businesses, that sort of thing. And the evaluation was generally positive, but it found that some of the beneficiaries were directly connected to the company, officers of the company, people sitting on the board of directors. And legislators took a step back and said that wasn't our intent. Our intent was not to incentivize people affiliated with these companies to invest, but to bring in new investment into the state. So they reauthorized the program. They actually expanded it, but they tweaked the eligibility criteria to try to get rid of some of what they called that insider investing. So that's a great example. If they hadn't gone back and looked at it, they never would have seen that. So that's a case where just a compelling finding, drew the legislature to make a change.
So Representative Becker, you mentioned that there was some pushback from some stakeholders, not so much from others. How did you go about from a political perspective, putting together the support needed to pass the legislation to get people on board with this?
Yeah, so we reached out to the business groups early, and for the most part, they said, we understand that this is just good government, and we just want to make sure that the evaluation is done by a neutral party in a fair way. And but so for the most part, they were neutral. The small business group, NFIB, was absolutely in support because they felt like most of the tax credits, tax breaks that exist actually benefit really big businesses. So they were actively lobbying it. But at the end of the day, even though the bill the first year passed the House unanimously, never had a single no vote, it was killed in the Senate. And it's just because one particular group wasn't on board. They're just nervous about we're nervous about the impact. And we hadn't gotten to a place that they got to be neutral. So it died in the Senate. And the following year, I think really just the right people actually. Pew hired a lobbyist, which helps, a very good lobbying team. When you have more folks understanding the bill and talking to people about the bill, that makes a difference. And I think that lobbying team did a good job of just communicating that the intent is for transparency and accountability, and we're not out there to demonize or target particular types of businesses. We just want all parties to be able to make all interested parties from the business community, the human services community, the legislature, the governor's office, to have a fair evaluation of whether what we are enacting as law is actually producing the results that we want. And I think everyone ultimately just ended up buying into that as a good policy. And so now what's going to happen is, also as a finance committee, what we started doing in the House is saying any of these tax credits, tax exemptions, tax breaks that come forward, we might pass them, but we're only passing them with a sunset in there. So they're going to sunset. So they will not automatically be in law forever and ever. And it's going to help us all if we actually have a good evaluation of them to determine whether they should live on or not. And one argument that I kept making that I absolutely believe is this is going to be better for the business community too, so that they can more strategically employ tax breaks and tax credits by having an independent third party review them and adjust accordingly. And shift where we need to be shifting. So
let's move from to some questions from the audience. If anyone has any questions for our panelists, right here.
There were a few states mentioned that have done this type of evaluation. Are there other states that have done a really good job at this type of work?
Yeah, I mean, what I'll say is most of the progress has been very recent. So we're just starting to see some evaluations. Indiana passed a law in 2014, and they've put out a couple evaluations that are very, very high quality, very thorough review of the programs. In the past, oftentimes states would do kind of ad hoc evaluations, kind of a a one-off. The Minnesota Angel Investor Credit, that was not part of an evaluation process. That was an evaluation requirement attached to that specific bill. Maryland has put out a couple of very good evaluations, and now you're starting to see sort of the next wave. Minnesota's about to put out evaluations, Nebraska, Utah. So I think and what's really exciting is, and particularly in sort of the context of this overall panel, is I think over the next few years, you're going to really see sort of an evidence base being established by states doing these evaluations. It really hasn't existed before. There hasn't been a place where someone who's going to start an evaluation could go to see what's a methodology that's been used by other states. And that when you have 20 plus states doing this, and we are actively sort of trying to keep those folks talking to each other, learning from each other. There's a real opportunity to really elevate, to really raise the bar on the quality of these evaluations going forward.
Any other questions? There. That's an interesting question. That's not an area that we've looked into. Oh, sorry, sure. The question was related to some states have what she called tax disincentives, where you have to pay additional taxes for doing certain things, and so the question is sort of what is the impact of that? I mean, in some cases, I would say there's a very intentional, behavioral goal in mind. For example, when states raise cigarette taxes, oftentimes there's a health goal to reduce cigarette smoking, and that has been reviewed by lots of health-related groups. But we have not included that in our research to date, and it's not covered by the scope of this particular law. Other questions? Right there.
Pretty loud. I was just curious, you mentioned that some of the stakeholders gave you some pushback on the front end. And so Bob, I was curious if you've seen it in any other states once the reports are out, if you get pushback, or is it kind of like the writing's on the wall, and people are really willing to accept the results?
So actually, I mean, so one comment related to pushback is we helped establish a process in Oklahoma that was in part driven by the business community, because they were tired of they felt like they were being arbitrarily picked on. Every session, someone would have an idea to sort of eliminate a bunch of tax credits, mainly focused on business, and there was no evidence, to defend those programs from a business standpoint. So their preference was an even playing field. Let's review all of these. We'll have a third party do it, and because it's on a schedule, and because people know when it's going to happen, it really created more certainty for the business community. So I think that's one sort of immediate positive, is that whoever the stakeholders are that benefit from these programs, the schedule is going to be published a year ahead of time. You'll know when these evaluations are coming out. In a lot of cases, our experience is that these evaluations often find that programs are working, but there are just ways to improve them. I'll give another example. There was an evaluation of an incentive in Ohio, and this incentive had a local match requirement. The local government had to pitch in to a state program, and the evaluation found that businesses found sort of the the application process frustrating, and the local governments didn't like having to give up the revenue. And based on that evaluation, state lawmakers decided to get rid of that local match requirement, but they maintain the rest of the program. So that's another case where that never would have happened in the absence of the evaluation. So I think the sort of certainty of the process, and I think if people feel like the evaluations are done, in a quality fashion, then you will start to build additional support for them over time.
Other questions?
Yeah.
Back there.
Particularly with business economic development tax credits, it's pretty easy to see the costs. You've got your tax expenditure. But on the positive side, we just looked in Wyoming at several bills designed to remove tax incentives, and there were long lists of industry supporters, but they didn't really have any data. And that's a problem for the economic development folks as well. I think you just mentioned businesses feel like they're picked on. Where are you at as far as getting benefit data for the economic development tax credits?
That's a great question. I think the question of data overall is an interesting one on the issue of tax expenditures. I think there's sort of two issues with data. One is that data, because tax expenditures affect programs across the board, education, health, economic development, the data is very diffuse. There's lots of different agencies that potentially have data that could inform the evaluation. So that requires better coordination across agencies, and we've seen that in some cases. The second issue is the data may not exist in a form that's useful, and I think you have to sort of go through the evaluation process to get a sense of what you have and what you don't have. And if you realize that you don't have sufficient data, particularly on the sort of job creation side, then the question becomes, there's a policy question as to, do we want to require some additional data reporting from recipients? That's what some states have done. The state of Massachusetts has a film tax credit, and in order to receive the credit, you have to report information on the kinds of jobs that you've created, both jobs that went to in-state people and jobs that went to out-of-state actors and directors, and that way the state could then evaluate how much of this is really benefiting the state versus sort of leaking out of the borders. But that required the state to ask the recipients to report that information. So, and that's a policy question, but I think, in the context of an evaluation, once people see what these things are costing, and if they don't feel like they have enough information on the benefits, then they may want to have a conversation about how do we get better data.
One of the issues that came up on our bill was confidentiality of proprietary business information. And so the bill is very clear that the state auditor can request information from the various departments, but that does not make it subject to CORA, the Colorado Open Records Act, that it still stays proprietary. And I guess one of the other, the bill specifically says that the state auditor is evaluating economic impact. And I maybe others have an opinion. She might say, yes, this created tons of jobs, or it saved the state money in all these different ways. She might use that dynamic modeling to figure out what the impact really is. The bill didn't end up saying you have to do it this way, you have to use this tool. It just says, look at the effectiveness, look at if there are better ways to achieve this goal, and look at the overall economic impact of this particular tax break. So the first report in Colorado is going to come out in 2018, and I look forward to seeing. When we were looking at the bill, I started looking at other states and what they were doing, and some of them were very detailed, and some of them were not. In Colorado, because the state auditor will be having to look at every tax break at least once every 5 years. That's a lot of tax breaks she's going to have to look at in a particular year. So there may not be an opportunity to go super in depth, and I think it's going to be a bit of a learning process and probably pretty iterative.
Other questions? I had one more. You mentioned the tax incentive from the 1930s. I'm curious about what that one was.
The earliest ones were all related to ag, I think, and there's There's some interesting ones in there that I always use this, and I'm sorry to pick on anyone, but there's one that's a tax credit for bull semen. That might be a great idea. I have no idea. I just look forward to seeing what the state auditor has to say about it, because it might be a really important incentive, but it's that kind of thing that maybe they make sense. I really have no idea.
Or not, but without data, how would you know, right?
Exactly.
So, yeah. Okay, well, we're out of time, so thank you very much for coming, and thank you to our panelists.